Many, many thanks. Distinguished guests, all of you dear friends. We are all familiar with the work of Fergal Keane, a journalist who has been involved for many years, shining a light on the world's blind spots. It is my great privilege, on behalf of John and myself, of the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Committee, and all of us here, to welcome him to Derry and to share his thoughts with us today. Fergal truly needs no introduction. In Derry, we knew him first as the RTE reporter and then BBC. Subsequently, he reported from many bleak and challenging situations, from the terrible violence in South Africa and Rwanda, and from all over the world. He has brought us narratives of embedded conflicts, of natural disasters and political turmoil, but always, always with an empathy for the plight of those who are most vulnerable, who are the ordinary people, the small people, who struggle to hope and to cope under the weight that they endure.
Thank you so much, Pat. That gets me right there. My flight was delayed, and I arrived on what's probably the 17th standing ovation for the President's speech. And as I walked in the door, the man standing just inside the door looked at me and said, "Good luck to you," he says, "you have a hard act to follow." He was incredible. The second person who came up to me in that Derry way said, "Oh, you're well overshadowed by the President." Thank you, Ken McGuinness. For changing the tone, making it less worshipful. It's lovely to be back here in this place. I have many fond memories of this city, and many of them were acquired during the Troubles, when I was first RTE and then BBC correspondent based in Belfast, but travelling over here frequently. Now, I'm always wary when I see the word lecture, and then you see the name of a journalist anywhere near it. What you don't need is journalists lecturing you about anything. I'll try and talk to you of my experience and the lessons that I have learned from that experience. And I will try to follow the imprecations of my grandmother in Cork, who said to me, "Whatever else you do, don't let us down, don't make a show of us, and try to be sincere." And speaking of sincerity, reminds me of a very famous, most of you will have grown up watching The Late Late Show, and Gabo when he was in his prime. And in the 1980s, during the last Great Recession, Gabo brought back young people from all over the world, young Irish people who had gone out to Australia, to America, to Britain, to the European Union, to seek work because they couldn't find work at home. And it was a very impassioned discussion. You had a panel of young people on one side, and you had trade unionists and politicians, industrialists on the other. And Gabo went around the debate in his usual agile way, and then went to each of the young people at the end of the show. And it was a moment of that kind of epic poignancy that only Gabo could pull off on the Late Late. And he looks at this young fella called Sean and says to him, "Sean," he said, "what is it you miss most about Ireland?" Sean sat back, looked him straight in the face and says, "You know, Gay, what I miss most about Ireland? What I miss most is the insincerity." Now, as Irish people of one creed or another, or no creed at all, we get that. I have spent 40 years now of my life as a journalist. The vast majority of that was spent in conflict reporting. And I have seen terrible things. I have seen the worst that humanity can do. Some of these things will never be erased from my memory, nor should they be. But I need to ask, do they have a meaning? Does the butchery I have witnessed, the slavery, the torture, the rape, the hatred, does it amount to anything more than misery in some human lives? Can I find in it a reason to continue to do what I do, but also to urge you to stand up and speak out and defend the rights of men and women you do not know? It goes without saying that I believe I can. Let me start by saying that the concept of human rights is rooted in the concept of respect for the individual, the single person. Hitler described the victims of the Armenian genocide as mere biological plasticine, a mass, and went on to butcher many millions himself. And to reduce any group of individuals to a mass, be they Jews, Muslims, Catholics, Protestants, Armenians, Tutsis, to name a few, is to begin the process of dehumanization and to take us away from human rights. Totalitarianism under Hitler, Stalin, Mao, all of them believed that to make an omelette, you had to break some eggs in order to create the perfect world, the utopia of fascism or communism. It was justified to crush many millions, tens of millions of human beings. You see where we go when we forget the sacredness of the individual. But the abuse of human rights also alerts us to the responsibilities of the individual. I'm not a believer in the great man theory of history. I believe great people do come along and can inspire us to change, but real change comes from the ordinary people when they are roused, hopefully by the higher ideals. To believe that everything must come from political leaders is reductive in historical terms, but it is also disempowering. If my work has any meaning, it is this, that each of us, confronted with the abuse of others, must, in whatever way we can, obstruct the forces of atavism, of sectarianism. We must stand against any who would tell us that another human being is less than us, is other than us, by virtue of their skin colour, of their religion, or where they grew up. The great South African writer Nadine Gordimer talked of the essential gesture. And by that she meant that moment, great or small, which is given to us to say or to do something which expresses solidarity with those who are outcast and abused. To this I will return. Now, my preoccupation with human rights begins with family and with country. I grew up in a family in North Kerry, and my first visit here was in fact in 1968. My mother was a school teacher at a convent in Dublin. And in 1968, we came up, myself and my brother were dragooned into accompanying her convent girls on a trip up to the north. And my memories are pretty scant, but I do remember seeing a cricket field, I remember seeing a red post box, and I remember going to a wonderful model soldier shop in Belfast. And within a year, that world, which seemed to me as a young boy incredibly calm, incredibly ordered, had vanished. You all lived through what followed. In the South, my experience of the North was limited to what I heard and saw on RTE. And to us it was this steady, menacing drum roll, the announcements on the 1 o'clock news as you sat waiting for your lunch, that a part-time member of the UDR had been shot dead in County Fermanagh, or a Catholic man had been found butchered in an alleyway in North Belfast. It went on and on. We were conscious, of course, of the presence of soldiers occasionally on our own streets, usually guarding banks, the occasional shooting of a policeman in the south. But the north was far away to us, and we turned away from it. We didn't want to know. It was too intractable. The Northerners were the whiny monies. They were the people who would say to us, "You Free Staters have betrayed and abandoned us," or they were the ones who said, "You're just coming here because you want to steal our country." The view in the south was that this was a no-win. Nothing could possibly happen. That changed for me when I came to live here. It was in the middle of the 1980s when the killing and butchering was going on and on. And I learned a number of very profound lessons. The first was the importance, or it was gratitude to RTE for sending me here, because I would have been a very different person. I would have had a very different perspective on human rights had I not been sent here. But the importance of seeing something beyond the angry voices, of looking to those, particularly in civil society, who kept this place going. To those of you who stayed, who did not leave, and were part of more constructive processes. And I came here and was inspired and horrified. And by the end, in 1990, when the BBC, I had by then joined the BBC, offered me the possibility of going to South Africa, I couldn't see any way forward here. I could see that there were people working, but as far as I was concerned, the politics had become a dialogue of the deaf. And so I jumped at the opportunity to go to a place where it seemed the heave of history was pushing people towards a transcendent moment. And I arrived in South Africa, and within a few days I had met Mandela, this icon of human rights. I went through the townships month after month, year after year, following the fortunes of people who suffered incredible abuses of human rights, but knew that history was on their side. That was the difference between this place and that place. In South Africa, the black majority, in spite of the immense oppression they were facing, had a certainty about a political outcome because the numbers were different. There was an overwhelming majority that ultimately was not going to be denied. This place was much more difficult. Much more difficult. And so I was there on that wonderful day in April 1994 when South Africans voted for the first time in a democratic election. And if you ask me about, when I think about human rights, I think of that morning in Soweto. And on the very first day, it was the old and the infirm who were allowed to vote. And driving into that township and seeing queues like I had never seen before, just snaking around and around the blocks of these small little township houses, most of them leading to churches or schools where people voted, and going to the top of the first queue that we came across in a church, and meeting an old woman there and asking her how long she'd been waiting to vote. And she said, "Well, I came here last night." And this was April, it was still cold, the southern winter. And I said to her, "Would you, my God, it must have been pretty grim waiting here all night. Did you mind waiting all night?" She said, "Listen, young man, I've waited all my life. My mother waited all her life. My grandmother waited all her life. They didn't get to vote. A few hours in the cold isn't bothering me." And at the end of that day, that transcendent day, I stood outside another church, and we were going live, broadcasting into Radio 4 at tea time, and the voters were coming out of the booths. And I stopped a man named Simon Captain, and I said to him, tell me something about your life. What brought you to this point? And he described how he was limping, had been tortured by the security police, how a son of his had been killed in the struggle, and another had fled into exile. And I said to him, look, can you just briefly, because we've only got a couple of minutes left, encapsulate what this day means to you? And again, he said, young man, I was in those days. He said, he said, today I became a human being once more. If you take nothing away from this lecture, take those words. Today I became a human being once more. Because that's what it's all about. Recognizing our essential humanity. That is what democracy does. That is what the laws that we have to protect human rights do. Our inviolable humanity. And I got it from that man that day. So if South Africa was my transcendent moment in terms of human rights, the very opposite would occur within the space of a few weeks, when I was sent by the BBC to Rwanda. I knew nothing about that country, apart from the fact that they'd made a movie about the gorillas in the mist and an American heroine who tried to save them and was killed for her troubles. When I arrived, I found the emptiest place on earth. A country, it was as if somebody had come along with a huge hoover and gone across the landscape and sucked all of the life out of it. To the widows left with the long silence after death, an end to body parts on the streets, to the blood congealing on the floor, to men and women vanishing, to lost decades in prisons, to death squads, to the bodies tortured with cigarettes and electric drills. All of these things were ours. All of these things distorted our humanity. They reduced every single one of us. Now, the agreement didn't take away bigotry, nor, sadly, has it taken away the old habit on this island of rewriting the past to suit our present political agendas. It couldn't, of itself, create the common ground upon which we might see each other as something other than Protestant or Catholic, nationalist or unionist, Southern or Northern, British or Irish, or, perish the thought, to see each other as none of the aforementioned and as simply human beings. But it did stop the killing, and that is why it is sacrosanct. Get that word, sacrosanct. The future of peace on this island is for now tangled in the nets of Brexit, not waving but drowning. Too many of those who pontificate on the subject of the border across the water have no idea about the dynamics, historical and contemporary, of life in Northern Ireland. Others are blinded by atavistic loyalty. The Good Friday solution was an imperfect solution, of course. Any solution to the mess made by centuries of history was going to be imperfect. But it is the best deal possible for the foreseeable future. The current politics of direct rule infantilizes the North, and it leaves a vacuum where fear feeds and grows stronger. The political leadership that could re-energize the agreement has gone missing. It's gone absent without leave. And as so often before in history, Ireland has become a bit part player in the larger dramas of British politics. This never ends well. Peace came about 20 years ago because the leaders of that time, Hume, Blair, Ahern, Trimble, Adams, McGuinness, and others, worked tirelessly under the wise and patient stewardship of Senator George Mitchell? Where is that vigour and determination now? The British government is preoccupied with Brexit, but that saga will be resolved one way or the other. Deal or no deal, a deadline looms. Something will be done about the border that either diffuses the tension or provides political and potentially something more lethal ammunition to dissident Republicans. But there is no deadline for a return to cooperation here in the north. We have drift instead. And without a return to power-sharing government, the dark shadows will continue to multiply. I don't believe that we can be sanguine. I don't believe that violence has absolutely gone away for good. We had long periods of peace in the 19th and 18th centuries. But violence, fed by fear and intolerance, exploded again. I will just say that the politicians of this generation will be tainted for posterity if they let the opportunity represented by the Good Friday Agreement to be lost. On the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Movement, we can look back on 3 decades of death and strife with a sense of humility. Now, as I pointed out earlier, with my own background, I don't stand here to issue condemnation of those who killed, whatever side they were on. But I do ask that we be honest with ourselves, that we don't indulge in retrospective justifications or narrativize the past into a comforting myth. We've done too much of that. We witnessed on this island, but especially here in the north, a tsunami of human rights abuse. Let nobody tell you it was a price that had to be paid. It was not. The only correct response when we look at the past is of profound pity for what was inflicted on so many, and a determination that we should never go there again.